Despite years of claims that full self-driving is just around the corner, there are still profound hurdles to getting FSD to work all the time. Is it even possible with Tesla's hardware and software approach to get full self-driving to work at all? Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. This channel is dedicated to finding out whether I really do know it all or not. Make sure you like and subscribe, and definitely ask questions in the comments or at my email address. And as I've said in the previous episode, if we hit 500 subscribers, I'm going to do a giveaway, so make sure you subscribe for more interesting information, but also to get involved in the giveaway when it happens, hopefully soon. So today's question, whether Tesla can actually implement full self-driving in a complete package, and I'll get into exactly what that means in a bit, but that question is a profoundly difficult question to answer, and I'm sure the people working at Tesla feel the same way about it. But I want to make it very clear that I have no insider information about Tesla. I'm speculating from what I know from the public. Elon Musk has done quite a few interviews. They're quite useful. I've looked at a lot of other people's papers and interviews and so forth. So again, I'm working from just the knowledge that I have, so I just want to make sure that that's very clear. The reason why this is an important question is because there are really profound consequences, not just for the world sort of at large, but also for Tesla itself. And as a potential Tesla driver and as a current Tesla stock owner, it's very important to me to understand how this all works, because the consequences to me as a person, like a human being driving, but also to me as a stock owner, are really profound. And it makes a big difference whether Tesla actually gets this to work and whether they get there first or not. So here's the problem in a bit more of an abstract manner of putting it. What you need from an AI in order to do full self-driving is a cognitive machine that's flexible and adaptive to novel circumstances. And the problem is that AI traditionally has been terrible at this. AI will do a good job, it'll define like a cat or a dog or something like that. If you give it a picture of a tiger, or even if you give it a cat or a dog of a breed that it doesn't know, oftentimes it completely fails. If you add things like a tiny amount of noise to the image that you can't even see, in other words, the pixels have just a little bit of variation to them, it can fail. So, and this is state of the art AI stuff here. So we're not talking about stuff from the 80s and 90s. This is current stuff that will still fail if it's given even slightly varied situations that it doesn't understand. So this is a really big problem, and it's not clear whether this can be solved or not. In order to look at this, let's kind of step back a little bit and let's think about how a human being learns to drive first, and then think about how an AI would go about learning to drive itself. So a human being, the first thing that happens, and this is really important, is you get approximately 16 years of learning how the world works. Now, I know laws are different. It might be 15 in some places and 18 in whatever, but whatever. We'll just, so you get a decade and a half ish to learn about how the universe works. That means you get to learn about physics, like how do things work when you drop them or push them or something. You get to learn about lighting. You get to learn about how objects look when they're rotated, like my hand. Cool. You get to learn about how other people think, right? If you are dealing with another human being and they make a frowny face or something, what does that mean, right? Is that person going to get aggressive with you? Are they going to hit you? Are they going to try to cut you off when you learn to drive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So all of that is a basis upon which driving is layered, which is a very different approach than what AI does. When the person actually sits down to learn how to drive, they first learn a bunch of rules cognitively. Now, some of this they may have learned before, but right, you learn things like the stop sign. You got to stop at the stop sign before you go through. You have to make sure nobody else is going. You have to stop at a red light. You have to go at a green light. You have to drive on the right-hand side of the road, or if you live in the UK or Australia or Japan, etc., you have to drive on the left-hand side of the road. So these things are varied according to local law, but according to your local law, there are very strict rules, and you learn them cognitively. You learn them as a way of thinking about the universe. And then what you do is you go out and you gain specific experience. Now, part of that experience is controlling the car itself, right? When you push the accelerator a certain degree, it goes a certain rapidness, it accelerates at a certain speed. When you hit the brakes, it decelerates at a certain speed. When you turn the wheel a certain amount, it does a certain thing, right? All of that is complicated for an AI to learn, but I'm going to put that aside for today because that's more or less a solved problem. So that's not a big deal. Control systems are not that hard of a problem anymore. They're pretty well done. But anyway, as a human driver, that's what you're going to do. You're going to learn how to drive and you're going to figure that stuff out. Of much more importance is figuring out the world around you. It's like, how does all the other stuff work? How far back do you have to stay behind another automobile if you're going 50 kilometers an hour versus 100 kilometers an hour? Those are things that you have to learn through experience. Generally speaking, how you do that is you go out with a supervisor of some sort, which could be a driver's ed person or your parent or something, and those people tell you when you've done things wrong or right. And of course, there's also just a general feedback loop in a human being, whereas if you have to slam the brakes on, you know you did something wrong because you weren't thinking ahead of time enough to adjust for the situation before it became an emergency situation. You get your driver's license and then you spend the rest of your life trying to master this skill, which is not an easy thing to do. I mean, there's a reason why young drivers who are 16 or 17 years old have the highest insurance rates for the most part, because they kind of suck at driving. They're still not very good at it. So it takes a long time to get all of those little nuances figured out. And if you look at the last video I did, I talked about that when we did a test drive of the Model Y, and I put it into full self-driving mode. It felt like a student driver. It felt like it didn't really understand the nuances of driving very well. Of note for future reference, every single human being has to do all of this stuff themselves, right? You can learn from a book, you can learn the things from reading about it, but every single person has to figure out the world around themselves when they're a baby. They have to learn to read, they have to learn to understand the world, they have to learn to understand all of the driving rules, and they have to learn all of this other stuff, right? And then they have to learn all of the experiences. So that's a critical disadvantage that human beings have, is that we all have to individually learn every single piece of the puzzle. How does AI learn to drive? Okay, so AI starts with a tabula rasa, or a blank slate. It doesn't know anything. In general, it probably just has a blank neural network that it started training with. Now, this would be years ago. Of course, now it's got a lot of stuff that's built in. But when it started out, it kind of knew nothing. So it's given control systems in a virtual world first, of course, not in a real world later, but it has a physical control over how to drive the car, etc. And again, I'm going to leave that alone. That's a complicated problem, but it's a solved problem. So assuming that the car can drive itself, the difficulty is figuring out where it's supposed to go, right? What are the rules? It doesn't know anything. It doesn't have a cognitive basis upon which to put this. It doesn't understand that you should drive on the right or the left-hand side of the road, depending on where you are to start with. It doesn't even know what a road is. It doesn't know what lanes are. It doesn't know what people are. So it has to learn all of these things, again, like an infant. And so it has to grow all of this stuff itself. So at least with Tesla's system, you have a visual system with 8 cameras around the car, which is 6 better than humans. You also have a radar system, and you have ultrasound that's going out and it's figuring out what's around the car. All of those things are put into a visual system that's then utilized to create a 3-dimensional map of the world around itself and then segment that into objects. Again, all of these are complicated steps, but they're at least mostly solved at this point. So I'm going to kind of leave them out because the most interesting aspect of this is the sort of cognitive systems that are involved and how the autonomous system deals with all of the pieces of the puzzle. So as the system is learning, it derives rules itself from the circumstances. So they're not cognitively stated beforehand, right? You don't have an instructor that says a stop sign is a stop sign, stop at the stop sign, and then move on when it's safe to do so. And when it's safe to do so is a complicated question in its own right. What if you have 3 other cars there and one of them has a left turn signal on, right? So it's like, that's a very complicated situation to deal with on its own. But there is a cognitive basis to that you can tell another human being. You can't really do that with an AI. It just has to learn this stuff. Now, you could also argue that a human being as a cognitive system has learned this over years because, of course, you've sat in a car while your parents drove and you watched them do it and you cognitively figured out what a stop sign was as that was happening too. So this is where massive data comes in, right? This is where having not just one human being's experience, but billions of miles of experience of driving comes in, because you can feed this thing and it can eat all of this data and it can start to churn through it and it can figure out that pretty much 100% of the time, a car will stop at a stop sign, or at least come close to stopping. Some of us don't quite stop oftentimes at a stop sign. So anyway, but it can kind of figure out those rules. And of course, the trainers can explicitly tell it that it needs to do a better job of stopping. If it tends to behave a little bit more like a human being and kind of roll a stop sign, it can get punished for that. So you can build that into a loss function. So you can make it drive well in terms of obeying those kinds of laws. So in terms of the normal situation, it can learn to do things pretty well. But the really interesting part comes about in the psychology of other human beings that it has to deal with, and in the edge cases that it has to deal with. So here's where cognition comes in. At the moment, the control system of the car is doing something, right? So previous to this, the AI control system has told it to do something. It said steer left, steer right, accelerate, brake, whatever. And so that the control system's controlling the car at the moment. The job of the navigation, full self-driving AI is to tell it what to do in the next millisecond, what to do in the next second, hopefully what to think about doing in the next 6 to 10 seconds, right? So it needs to be planning it out just like you as a human driver would be doing. And it needs to figure all of that stuff out. And it also needs to actually have some sort of concept that cars and a person walking are objects that are different from, let's say that there's a box in the road. A box in the road is a physical object. You have to deal with it. You have to steer around it or something, but it is not going to get up on its own and start walking away now. No, it might, right? Maybe there's a dog inside it or something. But for the most part, you can trust that a box is just a box and it's going to behave like a physical object. Or if it falls off the back of a truck, it's going to bounce in a certain way because it's learned these physics rules. A human being, in other words, someone driving a car, or somebody at the side of the road on a sidewalk, or somebody who's walking across a crosswalk, all of those things have a cognitive capability and they're able to change their mind. And that makes them much more complicated to deal with, right? Dealing with an object that is only obeying the laws of physics is one thing. Dealing with an object that could change its mind and decide to suddenly swerve in front of you is a whole different matter. So you have to treat those two things differently. And that's a complicated thing for an AI, right? Because it's got to sort of build some sort of model of other. It's got to understand that there are other agents in the world, and those agents could do things either cooperatively or antagonistically to either help or harm your agent as it is driving. So here you have to start prioritizing. You have to prioritize the critical, or what needs to happen immediately. And then you have to prioritize the medial, or what could be happening in the very near future. And then you have to take everything else. And all of that other stuff needs to be dumped. And that's actually a very important thing, is figuring out what's not important so that you can dump it. Because no agent, including human beings, can deal with all the data. So we have to figure out how to discard information. That's actually a huge task. I think it was Steve Jobs that said something like, saying no is the more important part of a design process. Well, you could think about this in terms of being a human being, or specifically driving, that saying no is more important, like getting rid of the fact that 20 meters away is another car that's sitting in a parking lot, or a tree, or some grass, or things like that, right? All of that is inconsequential information to what's going on. It's not critical. And so the AI has to learn to discard that information, and that's very important. I think it might have been Dwight Eisenhower that had this grid that was like critical, important, plan, and then critical but unimportant, delegate, and then everything else, dump. So it was kind of an interesting thing. It was like, if it's unimportant and not like super time sensitive, dump it. And so it's kind of an interesting way of thinking about it. So it's plan, delegate, or dump. So delegation is kind of pushing to let's say if there was a portion of the AI that was built in to start planning for things that were going to happen in the next few seconds. That's where that would go. The critical is something that could happen immediately within milliseconds or seconds, and the AI has got to deal with it right now. Given all of the information that the AI takes in and what it's got and so forth, what it's got to do is it's got to make a prediction based on the most likely outcome of what will happen next and what it should do in order to compensate for that. Now, that could be as simple as the fact that the road is starting to bend and it needs to start making a very slight right-hand turn. It could be an incredibly complicated thing where a skateboarder's on your right-hand side and somebody's walking out, jumping from behind a car to go get in their car, and so the car door is opening, and then a bird flies across, right? You got to ignore the bird, you got to deal with the human being, and then you also got to deal with the fact that there's a person who's opening up a door on the other side of the road, and so you can't swerve too far, right? So it can go from the very, very simple to the very complex, but it's got to be able to make those decisions pretty much flawlessly. Okay, so let's say 99.99 something percent of the time, it's got to make those critical decisions flawlessly. What ends up happening is, let's say 90 to 95% of cases are what I would call normal, which means that there's a lot of data for those. So that means that in those circumstances, it happens to a normal driver like every day or every week or something. So there's many, 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 many repetitions of this. So that would be stopping at a stoplight or stopping at a stop sign or making a right-hand turn or something under normal circumstances where there's not a ton of other people out there messing around with you. Those cases are going to be learned relatively quickly. Number one, because they're so kind of normal and there's a repetitive quality to them. So they're more or less the same every time. And also, there's just a lot of data to back them up. What becomes more interesting are the edge cases. So 10% of the time, or 5% of the time, or 1% of the time, or as you start chasing the nines, 0.00001% of the time. So let's take an edge case like that, right? So a skateboarder comes out on your right, and the person opens the door on the left, and you're in a very narrow back road, and the car's got to figure out what to do next, even if that happens to be braking. That's something that even in my experience hasn't happened very often. So it's an edge case where it might be 0.00000 something 1% of the time that this happens. That causes a problem, not just because it's a very complicated situation, which edge cases often are, but also because you don't have a lot of data for that, right? So there's in machine learning, there's a thing called biasing the information, the data that you're training with, and that means there's famous cases of that, of like Google engineers, for example, trained on too many Caucasian faces. So face recognition didn't tend to work as well for people of color. And that can happen in much more automated ways too, right? So it's not something that there's an intentional data bias, but just because all the cars that are out there, there's only like 3 cases of this particular thing that's ever happened. That makes it very difficult because the bias is almost 100% not happening that way, and only this tiny, tiny, tiny data set of things that have happened that way. So you have to alter your training so that you compensate for that bias and you really shove those few cases forward and help the learning algorithm learn those other cases without sacrificing its normal driving behavior, its nominal driving behavior. That's a complicated thing, like a tightrope to walk, if you want to think about it that way. So what are the advantages of AI when it comes to learning how to drive specifically? Number one, it's got way more data than human beings now. At least in Tesla's case, they have billions, literally billions of miles of road data of people driving. Human beings, like, I don't know, I'm probably approaching 1 million miles maybe that I've driven in my life. That's kind of a scary thought. But anyway, it's orders of magnitude less than what Tesla has for their overall driving data set. AI is much faster. The processing power, especially with those GPU, CPU combinations, those are much faster than human beings in terms of the way that they're able to process data. Now, of course, they're also much less parallelizable, which means the human beings have an advantage in terms of our parallel processing. So it's a bit of a trade-off. But there's no question that compute power, at least the speed of it, is much faster than humans. The reaction time is much faster. If it makes the correct decision, it will make it way, way, way faster than a human being will. So that's a huge advantage for AI. AI can also share its data. As opposed to human beings that I was talking about, every single human has to learn about the universe and then has to learn to drive themselves. Once it's solved, or once one piece of it is solved or anything, all of that can be shared with all the other AIs that are out there. So if you have 1 million cars out there, that's 1 million things that immediately learn how to do whatever that trick was that the other thing learned how to do. So I think that's actually the most profound advantage that AI has is that it is able to share this data. And that's something that human beings can't do. Obviously, you can do it in the form of a book or a YouTube video or something like that, but then you have to expend the cognitive effort to learn it yourself. I mean, just imagine if you didn't have to learn Einstein's general relativity theory, if you could just go a la the Matrix, go and plug it in and actually understand that theory, something that complicated. You don't have to have someone teach you and spend months and months learning basic physics and then at least weeks and weeks learning the theory itself. You could just instantly, you got it. Whoa. The disadvantages of AI. Well, first of all, it has to learn from scratch. So it doesn't have, i.e. 16 years of experience. Although the more it learns and the more experience it has, effectively, we're kind of training the baby. So it's actually getting smarter and smarter. So if you have 5 years of training data and you've manipulated the thing, it's actually kind of a 5-year-old at that point, right? But still, when it starts, it is a tabula rasa. It has to learn things from scratch. The biggest disadvantage in my mind is that AI, even neural networks, are extremely rigid and extremely brittle. They solve a problem really well when they're trained to, but shifting the parameters, even by adding invisible amounts of noise or something like that, or flipping the image backwards, can completely break the algorithm. And that is a big, big problem, right? You need flexibility in novel situations in order to drive all the time on your own. As far as I know, the AI, due to this, has to learn every single edge case separately. That means that the skateboarder with the person opening the door is a case that it needs to explicitly learn. It can't solve that problem flexibly later. Now, Full Self-Driving 2.0, I have heard might actually be altering this a little bit, but I don't know. At this point, as far as I know, every single edge case has to be learned by itself, and that's a profoundly complicated problem because the world is an infinitely complex place. Also, obviously, AI is not cognitive. It can kind of seem like it's cognitive, but it's not cognitive. And the fact that it's not is a huge disadvantage. Human beings have a knowledge about the world. AI does not. At this point, at least, it does not. And this is why GAI, or generalized AI, is so complicated and difficult, because AI is really good, again, at solving very specific problems under specific circumstances. It's really bad at generalizing and synthesizing and understanding and cognating, having all of that ability.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
And that's why I don't know that GAI will ever become a thing, unless we perhaps change our methodology, or unless there's some profound new algorithms, or somebody thinks outside the box and thinks of something else that we could do besides neural networks, or maybe just more compute power, who knows? But at this point, it seems like that's an incredibly complicated thing to do because of the nature of neural networks and the nature of AI in general. So now we get down to the question of, can Tesla's strategy work? They've gone all in for vision / radar / ultrasound. They are not using LiDAR. LiDAR is a thing that Waymo and other companies are using, and it's again a very brittle system. So I think that Tesla has picked the correct path of the options that are obvious today. But the problem is that just simply might not be the best option, period. That just might not work. I will give Tesla the benefit of the doubt on compute power, because Elon Musk has specifically said that their new chips are powerful enough that they're not even maxing them out. So let's just assume that they have enough compute power to do this. They have more data than anyone else, so that tends towards the idea that they have enough data. But again, you get these 0.0000001 edge cases, and even with billions of miles of driving, that still might have only been seen a couple of times. So they still might not have enough data, which again, hopefully over time they will get more of. So the issue is that edge cases by definition are edge cases. There are fewer of them than there are the nominal normal cases. On the good end of things, Tesla has built a machine to teach the machine. In other words, it's built something that basically flags every situation where, I guess, either the emergency system was involved, or if the human being had to take over from the full self-driving or autopilot and control it themselves. Because that immediately flags something where it's like, oh, this did not function properly. There was an error there. And so it can then look at those edge cases. So it's a way of popping out and rebiasing the information towards the instances where it's not working. And that's a good way of bootstrapping, which is the methodology that Tesla is more or less using is that they're bootstrapping this, so they learn a bit and then they figure out the problems with that, and then they learn a bit more in a more specific way about the areas that they had issues in, and then they learn a bit more. And so they drive and they learn, and they drive and they learn, and they drive and they learn. So they're bootstrapping themselves up, which is a really big advantage, again, to having a lot of data and a lot of miles on the road, and having human beings in there too, because when they take over, that's a data point. That's like, oh, aha, something failed here and a human being had to take over the driving. With processing power and with data, the real question is the architecture correct? That is the question to answer. And Tesla relies on what they call the Hydra neural network, which is basically a massive neural net with all these little snake heads sticking out, which is why it's called a Hydra. And each of those deals with individual cases, but they all feed it to a central decision-making processor, which is kind of like, our brain. So we've got this central CPU, GPU thing that's actually deciding what's going on based on all of this information that it's taking in. Is this the best strategy for full self-driving? Well, the fact of the matter is no better strategy presents itself right now. So if it is not the best strategy, and if it's not going to succeed, there's no obvious other candidate that's better at the moment. That is not a guarantee that it's going to succeed at all, but it just means, at least in my mind, that it's got the best chance of succeeding. As I said before, neural networks are very, very brittle to any kinds of changes. So what you really want is something that can synthesize the information that it's already gotten and can react to novel situations in the best possible manner, like a human being does most of the time, right? So that's what's needed to make it truly work. Now, again, it's not at all clear that neural networks can reach this degree of flexibility or cognitive-like performance. But with data sharing, the problem only has to be solved once, right? If you can solve it one time with one car for 99.99999% of the cases, you can immediately share it to every other car that's using that architecture, and you can solve it for all of those. So if it works, it's going to be like that. It'll just instantly work, and things will get much, much better. I would say that there's no chance that you're going to be 100% effective all the time. And that's the case with human beings. We wouldn't have to have auto insurance if we were 100% successful drivers. Oh, I wish I could save so much money every year. But so what you have to do is you have to push the failure rate down to well below what the human failure rate is, which is kind of accidents per 100,000 miles driven or something like that, right? So you have to demonstrably show that with this full self-driving package, that instead of 10 accidents per 100,000 miles, there's only 2 accidents per 100,000 miles, at which point regulation will probably follow. If you think about it, human beings fail at driving a lot. There are accidents every day. Sadly, there are injuries and fatalities every day. And we accept human beings driving on the road, for now at least. So it's never going to be 100%, but the deal is it needs to be demonstrably better than humans. And I would say, at least in order to say that you've got full self-driving, it needs to be on a parity with human beings. In order for the regulatory bodies to approve it, it's going to have to be better. But in order for you to claim it's full self-driving, it at least has to be up to the level of human beings in terms of its capability. And it's definitely not there right now. So my prediction, it's going to get done, and I think it's going to get done with neural networks, but it's not going to get done on Elon's exceptionally optimistic time. I watched an interview that he did in 2019, and he said, by the end of this year, right? And he said, absolutely by the end of next year. Well, it's already August of 2020, and I don't think we're all that close to it yet. But generally speaking, I think that assuming the compute power and the data available, that neural networks will eventually become complex enough to behave as if they are robust and flexible, even if they're not actually robust and flexible. It'll appear so because they'll have seen so many weird, bizarre cases because of the billions of miles of experience that it has driving, that it will appear to human beings to be flexible. And that's pretty cool. If it can do that, if it can fake us into thinking that it's flexible and synthetic and cognitive, then that's good enough for driving. It doesn't matter if it actually is. As for the timeline, I would probably say a decade. I would guess 5 years to get to the full self-driving capability and chase the nines, and then another 5 years for regulatory approval in different localities and so forth. So, it might take up to 5 years less or more. So let's say 2.5 to like 12 and a half or 13 years is kind of my range to where it will become approved to drive on the road. And probably what'll happen is it'll get approved to drive on highways first and then back off into side streets and dirt roads and et cetera, as it becomes better at what it does. Now, Tesla's Full Self-Driving 2.0 that's supposedly coming out soon and is already being tested, that could be a game changer because I hear it is much, much more flexible. I am going to do another episode on that soon from what I can find out about it because I think it's actually a profoundly important question. But this video is already plenty long, so I'll save that for a future episode. I also think there's going to come a day when people are going to look back at human beings driving and they're going to be like, oh my gosh, those old-timey people that used to do this insane thing that was so dangerous. It'll be like those guys who sat on the skyscraper like I-beams and ate lunch without a rope on, and people go, what the hell were these people doing back then? That they're going to look back on this time and they're going to think people are nuts for driving themselves because human beings are inherently dangerous. Like we're driving around in 3,000 or 4,000 pound machines that are just designed to kill other people, right? They're just these moving masses and they'll smash anything that they run into. And so I think that we will eventually get to a point where people will consider it insane and you'll have to go on a special track or something to drive it yourself. It'd be like a horse on a highway nowadays, right? You know, you take the horse to like your horse farm and you ride around and people are like, well, it's kind of nutty, but whatever. They're just a goofball that's doing it themselves. But on a normal daily use case that people are not going to drive anymore. How does Full Self-Driving 2.0 work? What are the consequences if Tesla gets to full self-driving first or if they don't? That's for future episodes. So definitely make sure you like and subscribe, and for sure ask questions in the comments or at my email address, which is DrKnowItAllKnows@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and questions on this, and I look forward to future episodes about this. Till next time, bye-bye.